Hello Varlets. Welcome back to another deep dive video. Today we're taking a look at the Phosphor Blast Pistol, and as you can tell, I'm in the Psychinium. So this is going to be a different format on how I'm approaching my deep dives. And the reason I'm doing this is because, well, for two reasons. Number one, it's a lot more easier to put deep dives like this together because this very closely mimics how I would do my internal testing anyway. So I thought if I just show you how I do the internal testing and then kind of like organized it into a actual video, that would be a lot more quicker for me to put these kinds of videos together. But secondly, it allows me to show you more examples when it comes to the technical aspects of things, which I think will be quite valuable, especially when it comes to trying to understand a weapon like the blast pistol. So it's easier for me to show you things live rather than to do a scripted recording. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. I really appreciate your feedback on this. So let's begin. Let's start with the base profile of the blast pistol. This weapon is what I would call in a nutshell a utility weapon that happens to pack a very big punch. It has a base damage of 536. It has 6 rounds in the chamber with a sizable 72 round reserve. This is a lot considering that it's a hand cannon. It also has a rate of fire of 2 rounds per second. This is the same as the Zarona revolver. But it has a reload speed of 2.73 seconds, which is a good 1 second faster than both the revolver and the galvanic rifle. This is what I think contributes into why people like the blast pistol a lot compared to the galvanic rifle, because it feels a lot more smoother to use thanks to its reload speed. Now, for its main stats, we have a damage stat here, which governs our base damage, like I just talked about. We have a critical bonus stats, which affects our critical chance. This weapon at max, this stat at max gives us a 21% chance extra critical chance, so this is something we're definitely looking to max out. We have a mobility stat. We have a penetration stat, which governs the ADM values against flak, carapace, and unyielding, so we also want to max this out. And finally, we have an ammo stat, which influences how much of our reserves we get to play with. We also want to max this out. So it's pretty obvious which stat you should be maxing out here. You're going to max out all of this and only leave mobility as the dump stat at 60%. I also find it quite comical that these stats are just single lines. It's just damage, critical chance, and ammo reserves. It's quite comical for a weapon that is much more complex than it seems on the surface. Anyway, let's talk about the interesting part, its damage profile here. So, despite this weapon having a much higher base damage than the Zarona revolver, when we look at the actual numbers here, we see that it is lower. Normally, you would expect this 536 to appear the same as unarmored. That is usually the case when there is no difference between the base damage and unarmored profile. But here we see that unarmored actually deals 10% less damage. And the only reason why I can think of why this number doesn't match us is because the blast pistol has the innate phosphor burn damage effect, which is then taken into account into its base damage, which is why the base numbers are actually lower. In terms of what this weapon deals well against, it does well against unarmored enemies, flak armored, and maniac. What this means is that it will perform decently well against all human-sized elite enemies, and that is exactly what this weapon excels at fighting against. Against infested armor, it's okay, but you're not going to be using this against infested enemies anyway because you only have so much ammo. Against unyielding, it's fine. I think it works well against bulwarks and reapers, but against something like a plague ogrin or other monsters, it has too low of a base damage to be worth using as a main weapon. The same can be said against Carapace, which although it has a higher base damage compared against the Zarona, it doesn't have the multipliers to back it up. And so unless you have a very specific build that's designed to take out either unyielding or Carapace enemies, like my anti-tank ranger build, it is probably not worth investing in Carapace in that sense. Moving on to its weak spot multipliers, we have a weak spot multiplier of 1.36, which is lower than the average of 1.6. This is a bit of a surprise because I think I read this weapon in the description when it was first announced that this is a precision weapon, but with a weak spot multiplier of only 1.36, that is definitely not the case. It's not the lowest. The lowest right now is the arc rifle at 5%, but most of the other low weapons tend to be at 1.3, so this is falling more on the lower end. Where it does shine, however, is in its critical multiplier. The blast pistol has a critical multiplier of 2.18, which will run up to 2.2 just for simple math's sake. What this means is that scoring a crit is worth more than 2 body shots, and this is exactly how we are going to want to build our weapon, with an emphasis on critical chance, and it would skew how we want to max out this weapon's potential. Now, the interesting thing here is its critical weak spot. Normally, a precision weapon would have a very high critical weak spot multiplier. Something like the Transonic Blade has a 3 times multiplier on its heavy attacks, and the Galvanic Rifle, I think, has a 2.8 times multiplier. This multiplier is technically 2.45, which on paper sounds really high compared to its body shots, which makes sense. But If you compare its critical weak spot, which means landing a critical hit to the head, compared to just landing a critical hit to the body, the difference between these two numbers is only 12%, which is very, very low if you think about it. What this means is that this weapon is very forgiving as long as you can score crits. And this will tell us what kind of blessings, what kind of talents, and what kind of perks are going to be valuable for it. So as long as you can crit, this weapon will work very, very well. Doesn't matter if it's a headshot or not. Now, let's move on to the interesting part. The unique aspect of this weapon is the phosphor effect that it applies to enemies that it hits. Whenever you shoot an enemy, regardless if you are ADSing or if you're hip firing, you will apply a phosphor effect. This effect does three things. The first, as you can see, is that it applies a burn effect. This is called, I think, phosphor burn in the code. So it is classified as burn damage, but it is a unique form of burn damage here. It deals 20 damage at base and has a very, very low ADM multiplier of 0.1 against carapace. In other words, it basically doesn't do very much damage against carapace. But the upside is that it does last 20 seconds. In fact, all of the effects will last for 20 seconds. The second effect it applies is this brittleness stack here. It applies a 15% brittleness, which I must emphasize is a unique source of brittleness. So what do I mean by unique? In Darktide, brittleness have different rarities. In the Phosphor Blast Pistol's case, it is unique because that means it stacks with everything else. And by everything else, I mean it stacks with something like System Shock. So most common sources of brittleness will apply up to 40%, and it will stop there. But for unique sources, it can compound with the common sources like this. So what this means is that you can apply 40% from System Shock, and then hit the enemy once with the Phosphor, and you will get a total of 55%. This can be very helpful with dealing with armored enemies, especially things like the twins as well, because their head is carapace, and so their brittleness there will help a lot. This is why I say this weapon is a utility weapon that happens to pack a punch, because it's very unique in that sense. The last thing that this weapon does, which I also feel is the most underrated and underappreciated aspect of it, is that whenever you hit an enemy with the phosphor effect, you lower their hit mass by 45%. So to explain this unique aspect of it, I need to explain how cleave works in the game. Let me summon something else so it makes a bit more sense. Where's a berserker? Okay, right. So this is a rager. Every enemy in Darktide has a hit mass, and every weapon in Darktide has something called a cleave budget. You will cleave an enemy as long as your cleave budget exceeds its hit mass. So for example, the blast pistol can hit, I think it was 3 rages. 2 rages. So right now, you can see I shot 2 rages and I did not penetrate a third. So what this means is that my cleave budget could not exceed this rage's hit mass. So for example, if I have a cleave budget of 10, and these rages have a hit mass of 6, 10 would exceed the 6 of this one, and I will cleave through this enemy to hit this enemy. Because I only have 4 cleave budget left, 4 does not exceed this rage's hit mass of 6, and therefore I could not cleave to hit this rager. But because this weapon reduces the hit mass of the enemy's hit, what this means is that, as long as I don't kill them outright, the first hit will reduce their hit mass by 45%. That means I should have enough cleave budget for the next hit to actually hit the third, which, as you can see, I do. Now I have enough cleave damage to actually pierce through pierce through this rager and hit this one. This on its own, you might think is, okay, it's nice, I get to cleave more enemies with this weapon. But what people seem to forget is that this is a debuff. And debuffs linger onto enemies, which means they can apply to your other aspects. So what do I mean by this? Well, the fun part of this is that you can actually increase the hit mass of your abilities. Specifically, the Cord Claw. Specifically, Axial Slash. So at base, if I don't do anything, Axial Slash has a cleave budget of 19, I think it was. And that only allows me to cleave 2 crushers, right? But if I hit an enemy, 1 crusher, specifically the one on the right, because the Axial Slash hits from right to left, with the Phosphor Shot. Oh, it's a bit too far. Do that again. I can hit 3 crushers now, because I've reduced the hit mass of, well, the Phosphor affected this one. So I can hit 3 crushers, which you might think, okay, that's fine, The damage doesn't apply that much, but what it does is increase your capabilities for crowd control. And that's not the only thing it does. Because you also have talents that increase your cleaving power, like Shockline Breach Protocol. When you push an enemy, you get 50% more cleave, as well as Adaptive Combat Calibration. You can compound the effects of the Phosphor's cleave reduction, or hit mass reduction rather, and actually cleave a whole bunch more enemies. So if I shoot Oh, let me just shoot one more time. Oh, that's effective. If I shoot that, I can now cleave 4. Now this seems very light at first, but when you apply this to things on Havoc, for example, and you happen to hit an entire line of enemies with the Phosphor, that increases the crowd control capabilities and cleaving power of your Excel Slash, which might matter if you're holding the front line. So in the grand scheme, maybe it's not the biggest deal, but I think it's an aspect that is a bit overlooked, and I think there's potential for it to be used. So yeah, so that is the main attributes of the Phosphor effect. Now let's talk about the weapon's blessings. Or let me actually go to Hadron and talk about it, because it's a lot easier there. So this weapon has a lot of interesting blessings to play with. And given how we've explored the different aspects of the weapon, what blessings are going to be useful for it will be determined by how we want to make use of the weapon. So in my opinion, there are 2 ways you can use the weapon, either as a support tool or as a main hand cannon. And I'll explain that in the blessings combo section. But for now, let's talk about each of them. Powder Burn is, my opinion, not that great because 20% damage against suppressed enemies usually doesn't really matter, given that the enemies that can be suppressed tend to be gunners and shooters, which more often than not in a build that is dedicated to damage, you would just straight up one-shot anyway. So I think Powder Burn isn't a very useful blessing to pick up. Infernus is something I feel that has value, but under very, very specific circumstances and a very, very specific build. Now, why is that? Well, first off, let me talk about the good. This Infernus applies 5 stacks of burn on a critical hit that stacks up to 15 times. The normal Infernus that we have, like on the Recon Las Gun, or I think the Hellbore also, has a limit of 12 stacks. So this Infernus is special because it stacks 3 more times than normal. And the burn damage that is built up is also a great deal more. The problem is that this requires 3 critical hits, which, while it makes sense for a critical weapon, the problem is that most enemies you hit are probably going to die in 3 critical hits, even if it's a body shot, which, as I showed earlier, this weapon does absolutely fine on body shots. So against most of the elites, this is not going to work very well. If you shoot a Reaper, which you will probably aim for the head anyway, it's probably going to die in about 2 or 3 hits. If you shoot a Bulwark in the head, it's also probably going to die in 2 or 3 hits. So where you're going to find Infernus the most useful is going to be against monsters, or enemies that can take a lot of beating, like bosses, Plague Ogrins, the twins, etc., etc. So it's a very, very specific use case. But if you are designing a build for Infernus to work well, then that's fine. But if you're using it as a general use weapon, I don't think Infernus is that high of a value. Next, we have Hand Cannon. It gives you 15% more rending on critical hit. This weapon has generally pretty favorable ADMs already. This 15% will probably be most useful against Carapace, but the need to invest in critical chance to make the most out of Hand Cannon to only get 15% more rending, I think is not as valuable in my opinion. I think there are more useful blessings you can get to get more rending, or not more rending, more blessings to get more damage, and then depend on other aspects of your kit, specifically your talent tree, to get more rending from. So it's an okay blessing. It's definitely a nerfed version of the Revolver's Hand Cannon, which is 60%. But I don't think Hand Cannon is going to be a very useful blessing for the Blast Pistol specifically. Glory Hunter is, in my opinion, is always going to be a B tier blessing at best, because 25% of a burst toughness is always nice. But again, you're giving up offensive capability to clear problems for something that is going to help you recover and sustain for longer. But it's not the worst blessing, but it's not something that I would pick up either. The worst blessing is probably going to be Showstopper. Fat Shark has tried to buff this time and time again, and every time they do, I'm hopeful because I really wanted this weapon to be like the Sunshot from Destiny 2, but unfortunately it is still absolute garbage. Do not take out Showstopper. First, this thing activates 20% of the time, and it only activates 20% of the time on enemies that are burning. And when it does activate, it only deals like 50 damage in a very small area around it. So it doesn't even kill Groaners or Poxwalkers, which is hardly worth the slot at all. This is definitely the worst blessing this hand cannon can use. Don't pick up Showstopper ever. Manstopper is the next one we're talking about, and by now you've already probably seen the meme things you can do with Manstopper with its infinite cleave. So that's right, if you didn't already know, the word increased cleave here is kind of misleading because it actually gives you infinite cleave. This again does not work against Crushers because it has the innate abort cleave aspect for Carapace armor. I'm not sure if it's Carapace armor or is it Crushers specifically, but definitely Crushers cannot be cleaved. What you can cleave through is pretty much everything else. So if I just do a whole conga line of rages here, that's a lot of rages. And if you land a guaranteed critical hit, which I'm doing here with surgical, you just pierce through everything and apply Phosphor effect to everyone here, which is very useful for the Excel Slash, as I just demonstrated. So you can cleave through a whole bunch of them much easier, since all of them have a 45% reduced hit mass. So yes, Manstopper is definitely a very good blessing for very specific builds. This is, in my opinion, very good for support utility builds, because if you can happen to cleave a whole bunch of elites that are rushing towards you, your teammates' lives are a lot easier because they have lower hit mass, which means your team can cleave through them. They have reduced durability because of the Britano stack, and they're also taking damage over time. Very, very good blessing, Manstopper. Surgical is what I just demonstrated. This is an S tier blessing for this weapon because it allows you to guarantee a critical chance on your shot as long as you ADS, which isn't too big of a cost to do. But more specifically, this blessing works very, very well on weapons that are dedicated for critical chance. So if you're using an ACD build, which gives you a whole bunch of crit along with Flensing Protocol, I think, yeah, Flensing Protocol, I think the math worked out to be you only need to ADS for about 1 second to guarantee a crit. If you can guarantee a crit every 1 second, that means every shot will have Manstopper applied to it, which means you can actually clear rows and rows of hordes and elites very easily with this combination, for example, here. Kind of a spoiler for later anyway. So, Surgical, S tier blessing. On that same note, Crucian Roulette is actually really good as well. This is going to be more suited for a quicker, faster gunslinger kind of a playstyle where you're not intending to ADS, where you want to be very fast moving and just want to score the critical hits. This I used in some builds and it works very fine. I think sometimes I actually prefer Crucian Roulette over Surgical because of the way I play the weapon. So if you're going to be not ADSing a lot more, then take Crucian Roulette. Math-wise, on average, this gives you about 18% more critical chance compared to Surgical. So on average, if you're just spam firing like this the entire time, it will give you about 18% more critical chance than having to wait with Surgical like this. Right, so next we have Pinpointing Target. This is a decent blessing, I would say. The main reason why I think it's a decent blessing and not a great blessing is mainly because of the waiting time and because Opening Salvo exists. The 20% strength is really good. This compounds very well with the Phosphor effect because strength gives you more cleave to work with. This actually increases your cleave budget. So that means the Phosphor effect is going to be more beneficial if you have anything with strength on it, which includes Opening Salvo. But the reason why this is okay and not great is because Opening Salvo exists, like I just mentioned. Having this blessing is, in my opinion, very free, and I will demonstrate that. So the way Opening Salvo works is that you need to wait for your weapon to settle for it to count, for the shot to reset. So as you can see in my HUD bar, Opening Salvo is active. If I shoot, you see it momentarily goes off, and it only comes back on once my blast pistol settles again. That means you can, as long as you fire whenever it comes back, this is the fire rate you can do to consistently get the 20% strength, which is a lot faster than the 2 seconds pinpointing target requires you to wait. So this is not bad, and as you can see, it synchronizes decently well with Surgical. Surgical is giving me about 2 stacks every time I can trigger Opening Salvo again, which means I'm getting 20% extra critical chance for firing at my optimal fire rate to make the most of Opening Salvo. Opening Salvo, in my opinion, is an A tier blessing, and I think is one that I find a lot of use in my builds as well. So yeah, that was overall all the blessings we covered. I think the most useful ones are going to be Surgical, Opening Salvo, Crucian Roulette, Manstopper, and Infernus in some specific builds. Now, before I forget, because the last 2 deep dives I've been kind of forgetting to my perks because I keep saying they are build specific, this is where I can explain what perks are going to be useful here. So for that, let me just go and refine. So right now I have on my weapon kind of like throwaway perks because I'm just using this for testing. But the good perks are going to be Flag and Maniac. This is mainly because if you're going to use this as an elite killer, this will give you the most broadest coverage. This will help you deal with gunners, ragers, it will help you deal with specials and mutants, or generally you want to melee mutants. But against Drake Ragers, this is going to be really, really helpful. Now, when it comes to unyielding damage, I I'm kind of torn on this because on one hand, if you're going the Infernus route and you're using your Blast Pistol as the main weapon against a boss, so a Plague Ruin for example, then Unyielding would make more sense. However, if you are just going to use your Blast Pistol to apply the Infernus effect and then swap to your melee weapon, then there's really no point using Unyielding because the damage from this does not carry over. So if you're going to do that, you would much rather your primary weapon, your melee weapon in this case, have the Unyielding damage and then just have your Blast Pistol apply the Infernus stack. So I don't think that Unyielding is going to be very useful for this weapon, even if you're using it as a support weapon for boss damage. Carapace is kind of the same situation as Unyielding, unless you have a very specific build, like I mentioned, the Anti-Tank Ranger, where you are using the Blast Pistol as the primary means of actively dealing with Carapace enemies. I have a build that I've been messing around with that does this exact thing, but I will share that with you when that video is ready. The other useful blessing is definitely going to be critical chance. This 5% extra crit chance will represent I think it was 9% extra crit chance, well, relative crit chance in a crit maximized build. So this will be useful if you are going for a crit maximization, but if you're not, then I think it will still give you some value, although if you're going for a generalist support build, for example, if you're going for a Crucian Roulette Infernus build just to dump Inferno stacks onto a boss, then yeah, crit chance is going to be helpful there. Everything else is, probably not going to be worth you putting on ahead of the other options that you have up here. Maybe elite damage if you're going for a Carapace maximized build. I might have to do a bit more breakpoint testing to see if that's worth the case. So that is the case for perks. Either take Flak and Maniac or Carapace if you have a very specific build. Otherwise, take critical chance if you're going for a support build and if you have Infernus or Manstopper slotted in as well. So yeah, those are your perks. Now for this section here, I'm going to share some potential blessing combinations that I've been messing around with. The first of which is definitely going to be what I just showed. It's going to be the Surgical Manstopper build. This is a very good support weapon. So if you want to whip out a weapon to kind of thin down the horde or really apply a whole bunch of phosphor stacks to enemies that are incoming, then that is going to be a very good combination. Another combination is going to be Infernus along with Crucian Roulette. This is going to be a nice spam fire build to apply Infernus stacks into a boss or monster, so you can maximize your Inferno stacks and then have your Servo Skull maintain the stacks. I think Reginald has showed a video on this before. It's decent, it's okay. Your hand cannon still does decently well because of the Crucian Roulette's critical chance. One of my favorites is going to be Crucian Roulette along with Opening Salvo. This is a build that is much more faster paced than using Surgical, but also leverages most of the Phosphor Blast Pistol's unique capabilities, which is maximizing its critical damage profile through Crucian Roulette, as well as using the hit mass reduction using Opening Salvo. There is I'm not sure if it's going to be a very useful combo, but it's using both Surgical as well as Crucian Roulette. This is a definitely crit maximized build. I'm not sure how it actually performs compared to something with Opening Salvo instead, but maybe I'll explore that in the later video. But yeah, so that is it for the Blast Pistol deep dive. This is a different format, and so it's going to be maybe a bit more longer, but as you can see, it allowed me to be a bit more technical and a bit more personal with how I demonstrate things here. So once again, let me know what you thought of this video, and I'll see you in the next one, Varlets.